The first shot is a violation. It rips through the monumental silence of the Seelow Heights on the morning of May 12, 1945. A single, sharp crack, echoing across the cratered earth and the skeletal remains of a forest. It comes from the dense green wall of pines west of the Oder River. Captain Andrei Volkov freezes in the middle of the camp. He is shaving, a small mirror propped on the hull of a scorched German half-track. The blade stays against his throat. For a heartbeat, the entire 303rd Battalion seems to hold its breath. The sound is alien now, an obscenity in the new world of peace. It is followed not by an explosion, not by the familiar fury of battle, but by a deeper, more profound silence. Volkov's eyes meet those of Sergeant Mikhail Gromov, a mountain of a man from Siberia. Gromov is meticulously oiling the bolt of his Mosin rifle. His hands stop moving. In that shared glance is 5 years of war. That was a German rifle. A Mauser Kar 98K. They know the sound like they know their own heartbeat. A 2-man patrol is overdue. Volkov leads the search party himself, Gromov at his side with 5 other grim, quiet soldiers. They move not like men on a victorious stroll, but like they moved a month ago, spread out, low, weapons unslung, eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. The forest is alive with normal sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves. It feels like a mockery. They find Private Yevgeny Yasha Malishev first, the young, round-faced signalman who just last night played a bittersweet melody on his harmonica to the silent applause of his comrades. He lies face down in a carpet of pine needles. The entry wound is small, neat, in the center of his back. A sniper's shot, from distance. Professional. Unemotional. 30 meters ahead, they find his partner. It is the sight of Corporal Leonid Petrov that punches the air from Volkov's lungs and draws a guttural curse from Gromov. Petrov is not simply dead. He is staged. He sits propped against the thick root of an ancient oak, as if taking a rest. His eyes are closed. His helmet is placed neatly beside him. His PPSH-41 submachine gun is gone. But on his lap, arranged with chilling precision, are all the items from his ammunition pouches. Spare drum magazines, each one empty, laid out in a perfect row. Placed on top of them, like a paperweight on a bureaucrat's desk, is a single, unused 9mm pistol cartridge. German manufacture. This is not a battlefield kill, this is a statement. A cold, meticulous autopsy of a soldier's utility performed by an unseen hand. It speaks of contemptuous efficiency, of time taken in the aftermath. It whispers of a mind that is not panicked, not desperate, but operating with a terrifying surgical calm. Volkov kneels, his joints aching. He does not touch the body. He studies the scene. The ground around Petrov is scuffed, but there are clear boot prints leading away into the deeper gloom. The tread is deep, sharp, and unmistakable, the pattern of German army issue. But these prints are fresh, pressed into the moist earth long after the last rain. They are not from the retreat. They are from today, this morning. Gromov's face is a stone mask of fury, but his voice is a low, dangerous growl. He points to the empty magazines. He didn't fire a shot. They took his weapon and counted his bullets. Who does this? Volkov doesn't answer. His gaze is fixed on the single German cartridge. A calling card, or a promise. More will come. The mood in the battalion's camp, nestled in a hollow by the river, shatters. The numb exhaustion of victory evaporates, replaced by a corrosive, familiar anxiety. The laughter dies. Men clean their weapons again, not out of habit, but out of sudden, sharp need. They look at the surrounding tree lines not as scenery, but as concealment. The war, which had become a fading nightmare, has snapped back into vivid, terrifying, present tense. Volkov makes the report by the crackling field telephone in his command post. The leaky cellar of a shattered farmhouse. The voice from regimental headquarters is laced with static and irritation. Volkov, the war is over. The document is signed. You are chasing ghosts, deserters, hungry men looting. Do not turn a mop-up operation into a political incident. We do not report continued casualties after the victory. You have a battalion. Solve it. Quietly. The line goes dead. Volkov slowly lowers the handset. The order is clear. Sweep this under the rug of history. Make the inconvenient dead disappear. He feels the weight of it, not just the bureaucratic cynicism, but the isolation. His command is now an island, trapped between a high command that wants a clean narrative and an enemy who writes his own brutal punctuation. He walks out of the cellar into the twilight. His men watch him. He sees the fear in the young ones, like Sasha, the replacement, who never saw Berlin, but now stares wide-eyed at the forest. He sees the hardened rage in the veterans like Gromov, who spit on the ground and test the edges of their bayonets. The battalion is no longer a unified force awaiting demobilization. It is fracturing into fear and fury. Volkov stands at the edge of the camp, looking into the darkening woods where his 2 men were turned from soldiers into exhibits. The silence is back, but it is different now. It is no longer the silence of peace. It is the silence of a predator. Deliberate, patient, intelligent. Somewhere in that vast corpse of a landscape, amid the rusted tanks and unmarked graves, the war has found a new, stubborn heartbeat. And Captain Andrei Volkov knows, with a cold, sinking certainty that settles in his bones, that he has just been handed an impossible task. He must fight a battle that officially cannot exist, against an enemy who is already writing its own brutal rules, to protect a peace that has already, here on the Seelow heights, been broken. The first shot was a violation. The staged body was a declaration. The war is not over. It has simply become a private duel. The forest swallowed them whole. 2 days after the killings, Captain Volkov moved not with the blunt force of a battalion, but with the sharp, precise needle of a hunter. He handpicked 12 men. Sergeant Gromov, of course, his face set in permanent granite. 3 other veterans with winter war eyes. And the young ones he needed to harden, including the trembling Sasha. They were a silent, gray ghost, moving against the deep green of the pine forest west of the Oder. They followed the map drawn from the boot prints. The trail was not made by a fleeing man. It was deliberate. It used the high ground, a slight ridge offering a clean line of sight back towards the Soviet camp. It avoided open clearings, sticking to the thickest brush, yet maintained a straight, purposeful bearing. This was not a panicked deserter. This was a patrol route. The discovery, when it came, was not of the enemy, but of his architecture. Gromov's raised fist froze the line. Ahead, partially concealed by a fallen log and a curtain of wild ivy, was a fighting position. It was a masterpiece of fieldcraft, a shallow, body-length hole dug into the soft earth behind the log. The excavated dirt was meticulously scattered and covered with natural debris. The field of fire was perfect, covering a narrow game trail that approached from the east, the direction of their camp. Inside the hole, the space was orderly. A spent 7.92 millimeter Mauser cartridge gleamed dully in a small pile of its own brass, collected, not ejected randomly. A small, empty tin of German ersatz coffee. And, most chillingly, a bundle of dried grass and twigs arranged as a makeshift pillow. This was not a temporary hide. This was a bedroom. A sniper's nest, maintained with fastidious, unsettling domesticity. The occupant had lain here in comfort, waiting. Volkov felt the eyes of his men on him. The professional admiration of the veterans curdled into something colder. The young ones just saw the lair of a beast. Sasha stared at the bundled grass, his mind clearly picturing a man lying there, peering through the ivy, his crosshairs finding Yasha's back. They pushed deeper, the forest growing thicker, the canopy shutting out the sky. The air grew damp and cold. Volkov's map was becoming useless. They were in a blank zone of old woods and forgotten ravines. And then the forest gave way to a scar. It was a ruined brick factory, a sprawling complex of low, shell-blasted buildings and tall, skeletal chimneys silhouetted against the gray sky. Windows were hollow, dark eyes. The courtyard was a graveyard of broken carts and shattered ceramic pipes. It was a fortress. Natural, defensible, commanding. From the tree line they watched for 20 silent minutes. No movement. Only the wind whistling through broken brick. They advanced in 2 teams, covering each other, darting from cover to cover across the open, killing ground of the courtyard. The tension was a wire pulled taut. Every shadow in a doorway was an ambush. Every creak of rusted metal was a bolt being drawn. Inside the main hall, they found the cathedral of the Ghosts' War. The vast space, open to the sky in parts, was a meticulously organized depot. Crates, some German, some unmistakably Soviet, were stacked against a wall with geometric precision. He identified tins of American Lend-Lease stew taken from their own supplies. There were boxes of German machine gun belts, full. Bundles of stick grenades, their handles neatly aligned. A medical station with stolen Soviet bandages and German morphine. This was not a stash. It was a logistics hub. Planned, curated, maintained. And in the center of the cleared space, on an upturned crate, sat the prisoner. He was a boy, 16 perhaps, dressed in the ragged, coal-stained uniform of the Volkssturm, the Nazi militia of old men and children. He was shivering, not from the cold, but from sheer abject terror. He clutched no weapon. He was simply left there. Gromov moved forward, his rifle raised. The boy whimpered, covering his head with thin arms. A search revealed nothing. He was unarmed. He had no papers. Only in the pockets of his oversized tunic did they find a few dried pieces of potato and a small, hand-whittled figurine of a soldier. Volkov approached. He knelt, bringing his face level with the boy's. The child's eyes were wide, swimming with tears. He was not a fanatic. He was a lost, starving animal. When Gromov pulled him to his feet, the boy spoke, his voice a cracked whisper, his German laced with a thick Berlin accent. The words meant nothing to the others, but Volkov, whose German was serviceable, felt a new layer of ice form in his gut. The boy wasn't begging for mercy. He was repeating a phrase like a prayer or a ward against evil. Nicht schießen, ich gehorche nur dem Gespenst. Ich gehorche dem Gespenst. Do not shoot. I only obey the ghost. I obey the ghost. Das Gespenst. The specter. The apparition. Before Volkov could process it, The first shot rang out. It wasn't the clean crack of the Kar 98K. It was the heavier, faster boom of a G43 semi-automatic rifle. It came from the high ground, the roof of a drying shed. The bullet smashed into the brick wall an inch from Gromov's head, showering him and the boy with dust and fragments. The world dissolved into noise and chaos. A second shot, a third, not aimed to kill immediately, but to herd. The rounds impacted at their feet, kicking up spurts of dirt, forcing them to scatter, to break from the cover of the main hall into the open courtyard. It was a controlled detonation of violence. A burst of German MG-34 fire, impossibly fast and accurate, stitched a line across the entrance to a side building, cutting off two of Volkov's veterans. The fire came from a different direction, a first-floor window. There were at least two of them. Coordinating. Volkov grabbed the sobbing Volkssturm boy by the collar and dragged him behind a massive, overturned crucible. Gromov returned fire towards the shed, his rifle reports booming in the enclosed space. The young soldier Sasha was frozen, crouched behind a broken cart, his rifle shaking in his hands. "Sasha, the window!" Volkov roared. The boy didn't move. A rifle round smacked into the cart's wooden side with a sickening thwack. Gromov lunged, not with his gun, but with his boot, kicking Sasha hard in the leg. The shock of pain broke the paralysis. Sasha screamed, a raw, furious sound, and blindly emptied half his magazine towards the window. The German fire paused, not because of Sasha's wild shooting, but because their point was made. A sharp, two-tone whistle echoed through the factory complex. A military signal. Disengage. Withdraw. And as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The MG-34 fell silent. No more sniper fire came from the shed. An echoing quiet descended, filled only with the ragged breathing of Volkov's men, the ping of cooling metal, and the soft, terrified weeping of the German boy. They waited, pressed against cold brick and iron, for 10 minutes. 20. Nothing. Cautiously, Volkov moved. They cleared the drying shed. It was empty, save for 3 more perfectly arranged, spent cartridges on the floor by the window. They cleared the machine gun nest. The weapon was gone. Only a belt of linked ammunition, precisely coiled, remained on the sill. The ghost and his men had vanished. They had used the factory not as a last stand, but as a trap, a demonstration. They had shown Volkov their home, their supplies, their discipline. They had shown him their helpless prisoner. And then they had shown him how completely they controlled the space. The attack wasn't meant to wipe them out. It was meant to mock them, to educate them. They retreated from the factory, dragging the shivering boy with them. The march back through the forest was a funeral procession. They had suffered no casualties, yet it felt like a profound defeat. They had been mice in a maze, designed by a meticulous, invisible hand. Back at camp, under a bruised evening sky, Volkov looked at the Volkssturm boy being led to the mess tent. The child kept looking over his shoulder, back towards the forest, as if expecting the ghost to materialize and reclaim him. The geometry of the situation was now clear to Volkov. His enemy was not a man. He was a system, a commander with a loyal, skilled nucleus, a fortified position, a supply chain fed by scavenging and predation, a clear, tactical mind that used terror and psychology as weapons. And he had a name now, given by a terrified child. A name that was not a name. Das Gespenst. The war had not just continued, it had evolved, and Captain Volkov was no longer simply hunting a holdout. He was conducting a siege against a sovereign, malevolent intelligence that had declared its own private armistice irrelevant. The Volkssturm boy broke in the soft glow of a kerosene lamp, not under interrogation, but under the simple, crushing weight of a warm bowl of stew and a blanket. His name was Klaus. He was 15. From a Berlin suburb swallowed by the Soviet advance. He had been handed a Polish rifle from 1914 and ordered to hold a bridge for the glory of the fatherland. When the tide rolled over him, he ran, not west towards the Americans, but east into the chaos, driven by a child's disoriented instinct to hide in the familiar ruins. The forest had swallowed him, and then the ghost had found him. Klaus's testimony to Captain Volkov was not given in coherent sentences, but in fragmented, terrified images. They were pieces of a mosaic, and as Volkov assembled them in the quiet of his cellar command post, the portrait that emerged was not of a fanatic, but of something far more disturbing. A perfect, functioning, military machine operating in a vacuum. The ghost's men, Klaus whispered, were not many, perhaps a dozen. Not boys, not old men, soldiers, real ones, from the Wehrmacht. They wore torn but clean uniforms. They shaved. They spoke little, and when they did, it was in clipped formal tones. They called their commander Herr Hauptmann, Captain. Klaus had been caught stealing from a crate of Soviet biscuits in the brick factory. Instead of shooting him, the ghost had put him to work. Cleaning weapons, sorting ammunition. The work was done under the silent watch of a grim sergeant with a scar across his cheek. The rules were simple, absolute, and enforced with cold, immediate violence. A man who lit a cigarette after dusk was struck so hard he lost teeth. A man who questioned an order spent a night tied to a post in the rain. But it was the ritual that haunted Klaus the most. Every evening as dusk fell, the ghost would appear from his private quarters in the factory's old office. He would walk to a specific, shell-damaged section of the outer wall that faced west. He would stand there, perfectly still, for exactly 10 minutes by Klaus's count. A faint silhouette against the dying light, as if waiting for a courier, a signal, reinforcements that never came. Then he would turn and issue the night's orders for sentry rotations and patrols. The orders were not strategic. They were administrative. Hold this position. Maintain watch. Volkov spread his own maps next to Klaus's frightened words. He procured captured German tactical symbols and a dull red pencil. He stopped being just a hunter. He became an analyst, a psychologist of a dead army. He plotted the factory. He marked the sniper's nest from the first killings. He triangulated possible observation posts based on sight lines and fields of fire. A pattern, cold and logical, began to bleed onto the paper. It was a defensive perimeter, a classical textbook Wehrmacht company strongpoint, scaled down to a platoon. It covered the approaches from the Oder. It had interlocking fields of fire. It controlled the high ground. It was the exact same tactical footprint a German unit would have established here in April to halt the Soviet onslaught. A terrifying realization crystallized in Volkov's mind. The ghost was not fighting a guerrilla war. He was not conducting hit-and-run sabotage. He was, to the letter, still executing his last legitimate military order from a chain of command that had ceased to exist. Hold the Seelow heights. Deny the enemy the approaches. The man was not insane, he was trapped in the final, unaltered moment before the collapse. His war had not ended on May 9th. His war had simply frozen, like a broken clock, still ticking in an abandoned house. Volkov requested records from regimental intelligence. The response was slow, begrudging. But eventually, a thin file arrived. It contained a partial roster of the 302nd Panzer Grenadier Division, obliterated on these heights in mid-April. One name was circled, noted as a skilled junior officer, a holder of the Iron Cross First Class, a professional soldier from a military family, not a party member. Reported missing, presumed dead. Hauptmann Erich Schroeder. The name meant nothing, but the details were a key that fit the lock. A career officer, a tactician, a man whose entire identity was the army, the duty, the order. A man for whom the unconditional surrender was not just a defeat, but an existential impossibility. How could you surrender when your last command was to hold? A true soldier did not surrender his post. He was relieved from it. That night, Volkov walked the perimeter of his own camp. He saw the contrasts, and they filled him with a strange, cold dread. His own men were falling apart. The bonds of discipline held taut by the shared goal of Berlin and survival were slackening. Men argued over looted watches. They drank too much. They talked endlessly of home as if it were a mythical land. They were men yearning for a future. The enemy, according to Klaus's testimony and the evidence of the factory, was doing the opposite. They were stripping away everything human, everything extraneous. They were regressing into the pure, clean, unthinking essence of a military unit. No past, no future, only the eternal consuming present of the duty. They were becoming hour by hour less like men and more like perfectly engineered components of a defensive system. A system with a single, flawless, broken command at its center. Hold. Volkov looked from his disintegrating battalion towards the dark, brooding line of the forest. In there was a machine of war, wound up and set in motion by a ghost, and it was running with chilling, perfect efficiency. It would run until it was physically destroyed or until it ran out of fuel, which, given its scavenging and the bounty of the abandoned front, could be months. He returned to his cellar. He stared at the map with its red German symbols. He was no longer facing a tactical problem. He was facing a philosophical abyss. How do you defeat an enemy who has already rejected the reality in which defeat is possible? How do you convince a ghost that it is dead? The calculus was clear. Regimental command wanted silence. The ghost's machine demanded conflict. His own men craved peace. And in the center of this impossible equation was Captain Andrei Volkov, a man of logic and orders, who now understood that the only language the entity in the forest would understand was the one he was so desperate to forget, the absolute, annihilating language of total force. A language that would cost the lives of men who had already earned their peace. He picked up the red pencil. He drew a single thick circle on the map, encompassing the brick factory and the surrounding forest. Not a patrol route, a battle plan. A look of profound resignation settled on his features, etching the fatigue deeper into his face. The duel had been formally accepted. The next move would not be a probe. It would be an excision. And he would have to order men who had survived the fall of Berlin to die in a battle that would never appear in any history book. The assault was not born of rage, but of a cold, surgical fury. It was an autopsy, performed with explosives and shrapnel. Volkov's request for a company of heavy machine guns and 2 mortar squads was met with incredulous silence over the field telephone. followed by a blistering reprimand from a faceless staff officer at regiment. The message was a scalding wire in Volkov's ear. You have a battalion. You have grenades and rifles. Use them. Finish it. No more requests. No more attention. The order was a death sentence for some of his men, and Volkov knew it. The knowledge sat in his stomach like a lump of lead. He assembled his platoon commanders and Sergeant Gromov in the cellar. He did not give a rousing speech. He laid out the map with its red circle. His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion, a recitation of grim facts. The Ghost's domain, the factory and its immediate wooded approaches, was to be erased. A full battalion assault, a classic pincer movement. First platoon would fix them from the front, drawing fire. Second and third would flank through the thicker forest to the north and south, hitting the factory walls simultaneously. Shock and overwhelming force. No subtlety. No more games of cat and mouse. This was a sledgehammer. The men received the orders in a silence thicker than the forest fog. There were no cheers, no grim determination, only a weary, resentful acceptance. They checked their weapons, distributed the last of the grenades, and tied extra ammunition to their belts with the solemnity of men preparing for their own funerals. The young soldier, Sasha, clutched his rifle so tightly, his knuckles were white bone. He kept looking at Sergeant Gromov, seeking some reassurance, finding only a face carved from Siberian granite. They moved out before dawn, a gray serpent, slithering into the blackness of the woods. The familiar tension was back, but it was different now. It was not the sharp, alert tension of the hunt. It was the heavy, dreadful tension of men walking into a slaughterhouse they had already survived once. They were not liberators anymore. They were exterminators. First contact was not with the ghost, but with his landscape. The forest around the factory had been transformed. It was no longer simply terrain. It was an extension of the German commander's will. Invisible tripwires of fine wire, strung at ankle height between trees, connected to bundled German stick grenades, lodged in the branches. The first explosion was a deafening crump that tore two men from 2nd Platoon into red mist and echoed through the pre-dawn stillness. The screaming started immediately, a high, animal sound of pure agony. Then the machine guns opened up, not from the factory windows, but from newly dug, camouflaged positions in the forest itself. Interlocking cones of fire swept through the trees, not aimed at men, but at the space between them, at the ground, creating a lethal, churning zone of dirt and splinters and ricochets. It was suppressive fire of the highest order, designed not to kill immediately, but to panic, to disorient, to herd. Volkov, advancing with 1st Platoon, hit the dirt as a burst chewed the tree beside him to pulp. He saw his men scattering, diving behind inadequate cover. Their coordinated advance shattered into 100 individual fights for survival. The flanking maneuvers collapsed before they began. The northern thrust was pinned down by a single, expertly placed MG-34 nest in a moss-covered ruin. The southern group ran into a killing field of shoe mines, their wooden bodies undetectable, their blasts severing feet at the ankles. The ghost had anticipated them. He had not just defended the factory. He had weaponized the entire kilometer of approach. He had turned Volkov's pincer movement into a series of isolated bleeding pockets. And then the snipers began their work. These were not the single theatrical shots of before. This was systemic, clinical elimination. A squad leader from 3rd Platoon, trying to rally his men, took a round through the bridge of his nose. A mortar crew, struggling to set their tube in a small clearing, was methodically picked off one by one. The loader, then the aimer, then the gunner, each shot arriving seconds apart, until only the silent tube remained. Volkov crawled through the hellish din, the smell of cordite and blood and damp earth choking him. He found Sergeant Gromov behind a fallen log, his face smeared with mud and someone else's blood. Gromov's eyes were not angry. They were horrified. He gestured with his chin towards a small rise ahead. Through a gap in the smoke and foliage, Volkov saw him. A German officer, standing in the open, on a fragment of the factory's outer wall. He was not crouching. He was not taking cover. He stood erect, a silhouette against the smoke-gray sky, binoculars in his hands. He slowly panned across the chaos below, like a general observing a field exercise. His uniform was worn but recognizable, the dark green of the Panzer Grenadiers, the silhouette of an officer's cap. He appeared utterly unconcerned by the stray rounds cracking the air around him. It was an act of sublime, terrifying arrogance, or absolute certainty. Hauptmann Schroeder, the ghost, a living statue of command. At that moment, a young soldier near Volkov, driven mad by the noise and the invisible death, broke from cover. He screamed a raw, wordless challenge and charged towards the factory wall, his bayonet fixed. The ghost lowered his binoculars. He did not flinch. He did not reach for a weapon. From a hidden position to the left, a single Mauser shot rang out. The charging soldier was lifted off his feet and thrown backwards as if hit by a train. He landed in a broken heap, dead, before he touched the ground. The ghost raised his binoculars again, continuing his scan. The shot had been protection, but not his own. He had a guardian, a precision instrument wielded by another. Volkov felt a scream of pure, impotent fury building in his chest. This was not a battle. It was a demonstration, a lesson in applied tactics. His battalion was being dissected alive by a surgeon who saw them not as human beings, but as disorderly elements in his pristine defensive schematic. The order to retreat tasted like gall on his tongue. He gave it anyway. The disengagement was a nightmare of dragging wounded, of covering fire that drew more lethal response, of leaving the dead where they fell. They stumbled back into their camp hours later, a broken, bleeding column. 23 men dead, 18 wounded, some screaming, some ominously silent. The cost was catastrophic, not in terms of the war, but in terms of the soul of his battalion. The light had gone out of their eyes. They had faced the meat grinder of Berlin and won. Now, in a forgotten forest against a phantom, they had been broken. Volkov stood alone at the edge of the camp, his back to his men. He could feel their stares like physical blows, accusing, lost, betrayed. He stared at his own hands. They were shaking, not from fear, but from a profound, seismic rage directed inward. He had walked into a master's trap and led his men over the jaws. He had tried to speak the ghost's language of force, and the ghost had replied with a vocabulary of annihilation, written in the blood of Volkov's soldiers. The message was clear. You do not understand the rules of this place. I am the rule. The ghost of the Seelow Heights was no longer just an enemy. He was the landlord, and they were trespassers in a kingdom of the dead, paying the rent in blood. The aftermath of the failed assault was a cold, septic wound in the battalion. The dead were buried in a silent, joyless ceremony on the banks of the Oder. their graves marked with rifle butts and helmet shells. No salutes were fired. The sound of a gunshot would have sent half the men diving for cover. The wounded were evacuated, their moans fading into the distance, taking with them the last shreds of the battalion's morale. What remained was not a military unit, but a congregation of the traumatized, bound together by shared dread and a corrosive, unspoken blame that hung in the air like poison gas. Captain Volkov became a ghost in his own command. He moved through the camp unseen, feeling the weight of his men's averted gazes. Sergeant Gromov no longer met his eyes. The old Siberian simply performed his duties with a mechanical, hollow efficiency, his once fiery rage banked to cold, dead ash. The boy, Sasha, now jumped at the sound of a snapping twig, his hands constantly trembling. Volkov retreated to his cellar. The maps with their red circles and bold arrows were lies. They were the language of a war that had ended. The ghost spoke a different tongue, the language of the land itself, of psychology, of patience. To fight him, Volkov had to stop thinking like a Soviet captain and start thinking like a phantom. He dismissed the reports from regiment demanding a resolution. He ignored them. For 3 days, he did nothing but think and observe. He sent out no patrols. He ordered no attacks. He let the silence from the forest become a tangible, pressing thing on the camp. He was waiting for the fear to mutate, and it did. It curdled into a hard, desperate anger. A need for retribution, any retribution, against the unseen thing that haunted them. On the 4th day, Volkov emerged. He gathered Gromov and 6 others. Not the most obedient, but the most cunning survivors. Men who had fought in the sewers of Stalingrad, who understood that war in close quarters was not about orders, but about instinct, treachery, and survival. He gave no grand briefing. He showed them no map. Instead, he laid out an array of captured German equipment on a blanket. A Panzerfaust, 2 MP-40 submachine guns, German stick grenades, a coil of their distinctive communication wire. He pointed to the forest. "We are not going to attack his fortress," Volkov said, his voice low and rough. "We are going to become a flaw in his system, a piece of grit in the machine." Their mission was not to conquer, but to corrupt, to infiltrate the ghost's perfected defensive reality and introduce chaos. They moved at twilight, not as soldiers, but as shadows. They wore a mix of uniforms, dark smears of mud on their faces. They did not take the paths. They crawled through drainage ditches, through thickets that tore at their skin. They moved with a slowness that was agonizing, a meter every few minutes, listening, breathing the dirt. Volkov's target was not the factory, but its periphery, the unseen network that fed it. The first objective was a suspected observation post Gromov had glimpsed during the retreat, a rotten tree stump on a slight rise, too perfectly positioned. They found it just after full dark. It was not a stump. It was a carefully constructed blind of logs and earth, dug into the back of a genuine stump, invisible from any approach but the rear. It was empty, but still warm. A German sniper's blanket, a water canteen, an empty tin of meat, and a notebook. Volkov took it. Inside were not personal notes, but log entries, in precise, spidery German script, wind direction, visibility, times of Soviet patrol movements, weather notes. It was a meteorological and intelligence log. The entries continued past May 9th. The last entry was from yesterday. 1830. Enemy camp quiet. No patrols. Morale appears low. The ghost was not just defending. He was studying them. He was maintaining a continuous intelligence picture. A cold smile, the first in weeks, touched Volkov's lips. He took the canteen and the blanket. He left something in return. Not a mine. That would be found. He left a single crudely carved wooden toy soldier, one of the trinkets they had taken from the body of a dead Volkssturm boy weeks ago. A tiny, meaningless piece of human debris, placed precisely in the center of the sniper's blanket. Let the ghost find that. Let him wonder what it meant. Let the first crack in his sterile reality be a sliver of inexplicable absurdity. They moved on, deeper into the ghost's territory. They found a buried cache of ammunition, expertly concealed under a flat stone. They did not steal it. They subtly rearranged it. They replaced a box of German rifle cartridges with a box of identical-looking but slightly different caliber Soviet ones. A sabotage that would not be discovered until a weapon jammed at a critical moment. They located a tripwire for a flare. They did not cut it. They added a second, thinner wire a few inches away, connected to nothing. A phantom threat to slow movement, to breed paranoia. They were no longer fighting the man. They were editing his world, introducing typos into his perfect, deadly manuscript. The climax of their night came near a silent stream that fed into the odor, a likely water source for the factory. There they found the guardian. It was the German sergeant, the one with the scarred cheek Klaus had described. He was filling canteens, his back to them, a rifle slung. He was a professional, but he was also a man performing a mundane task, momentarily alone in a place he believed was utterly secure. Gromov moved like smoke. There was no struggle, no gunshot. One moment the German sergeant was crouching by the water. The next a thick Siberian arm was locked around his throat, a knee in his back. The man thrashed, but Gromov's grip was implacable. A vice of corded muscle and cold fury. It was not an assassination. It was an erasure. Volkov watched as the life left the German's eyes, not in a flash of pain, but in a slow, bewildered dimming. They stripped the body of weapons, documents, and his distinctive field cap. They weighted the corpse with stones and sank it in the deep, dark pool of the stream. They left no sign of a struggle. They left only an absence. One of the ghost's precise, vital components had simply vanished from the board during a routine task. No noise, no body, no explanation. As they melted back into the forest towards their own lines, Volkov felt a shift. The oppressive, masterful control the ghost exerted over the terrain no longer felt absolute. They had touched it. They had marred it. They had proven that his kingdom of order had a border, and that shadows could cross it. He looked back once. The forest was silent, but the silence now felt different. It was no longer just the ghost's waiting silence. It was a silence that held a question, a note of uncertainty they had planted. They had not drawn blood tonight. They had done something more valuable. They had sown the first, fragile seed of doubt. And in the mind of a perfectionist like the ghost, doubt was a toxin more corrosive than any bullet. The ghost's response was not immediate. For 2 days, the forest was a vacuum of perfect, unnerving stillness. No distant rifle shots, no sign of patrols. It was as if the entity within had withdrawn entirely, digesting the violation. The missing sergeant, the corrupted cache, the wooden toy left in the sniper's nest, these were anomalies his clockwork reality could not compute. The silence was his recalibration. Captain Volkov used the time to transform his battalion's lingering terror into a razor's edge. He drilled them not on open assault, but on savage, close-quarter fighting, room clearing, grenade throwing in confined spaces, the silent kill. He turned the ruined village near their camp into a training ground, running squads through the shattered buildings until their movements were instinctive, brutal, and synchronized. The men, desperate for any structure to replace their fear, embraced the grim work. Sergeant Gromov's icy fury found a purpose, driving them relentlessly. Even Sasha's tremors lessened when his hands were occupied with checking the action of a captured MP-40 for the 100th time. The change in atmosphere was palpable. The oppressive dread was hardening into a focused, predatory intent. They were no longer sheep waiting for the wolf. They were becoming hunters of a different breed, molded by Volkov's new, cruel logic. The Ghost's counterstrike, when it came, was not against the camp. It was against the new reality Volkov was building. A supply truck from regiment, carrying mail from home and the battalion's vodka ration, was ambushed on the lone, muddy road through the forest. The attack was not a hit and run. It was a meticulous, theatrical slaughter. The two drivers were found seated in the cab, each with a single, precise bullet to the temple. The truck's engine was still idling. Every crate of vodka had been methodically smashed, the alcohol soaking into the dirt, the smell of spirit mixing with the iron scent of blood. The mail bags were torn open, letters and photographs strewn like leaves across the road, trampled into the mud by German jackboots. But one item was left untouched. Placed carefully on the truck's bullet-shattered windshield was Sergeant Gromov's captured German field cap, the one taken from the vanished sergeant. It was pinned in place by a bayonet stabbed through its crown, a crude, brutal exclamation point. The message was unequivocal. I see your corruption. I answer with annihilation. Your connections to the world beyond this forest are mine to sever. Your morale is mine to poison. The effect was catastrophic. The loss of the male, the last tangible thread to a peaceful life, was a deeper wound than any casualty. Men sifted through the mud-stained photographs of wives, children, parents, their faces etched with a loss more profound than grief. It was the death of hope. The vodka, their simple solace, was a pungent ruin in the earth. The ghost wasn't just killing them. He was methodically erasing the reasons they had to live. Yet in Volkov, the act sparked not despair, but a cold, clarifying fury. The ghost had made a mistake. He had revealed a vulnerability. His need for order, for symbolic retaliation, had drawn a line directly back to his core. The theatricality of the act, the placed cap, the ruined mail, was the gesture of a mind that demanded not just victory, but recognition. A composer who required an audience for his symphony of control. He's not in the forest, Volkov said that night to Gromov, his voice a low scrape in the cellar. He pointed to the factory on the map. He's in the center, the heart of the machine. He protects the approaches to prove his point, but his point is the factory. It's his command post, his arsenal, his proof that his war still exists. We don't fight through the forest. We go straight for the heart. The plan he devised was a descent into darkness, a mirror of the ghost's own unforgiving world. They would not use the roads or the paths. They would use the earth itself. There was an old, collapsed drainage tunnel on Soviet maps, a pre-war relic meant to channel water from the factory to the Oder. Klaus, the Volkssturm boy, had mentioned the wet walls in the lowest cellar of the factory. It was a mismatch of details that formed a terrifying possibility. Volkov selected 20 men, not a battalion, a spearhead, Gromov. Sasha, whose fear had now been compressed into a silent, lethal focus. Veterans of Stalingrad storm groups. They blackened their faces with grease and ash. They armed themselves with submachine guns, sharpened spades, bundles of grenades, and German phosphorus sticks. They were not soldiers anymore. They were miners of death. They found the drainage tunnel outlet half collapsed and reeking of decay 2 kilometers downstream. It was a pipe of crumbling brick, just wide enough for a man to crawl on his belly. The darkness inside was absolute, a thick, wet blackness that swallowed the beams of their feeble flashlights. The air was foul, thick with the smell of stagnant water, rot, and a metallic tang they all recognized from the trenches. They crawled in single file, the sound of their ragged breathing and the scrape of their bodies against the slick brick magnified 100-fold in the claustrophobic tube. The journey was an eternity in hell. Rats skittered over their hands. Icy, foul water soaked them to the bone. At several points, the tunnel ceiling had sagged, forcing them to dig with their hands, dislodging bricks that threatened to bury them alive. The psychological pressure was immense. This was the ghost's territory in its most primordial form, a lightless, suffocating artery leading directly into his lair. After an hour of crawling, Volkov's outstretched hand felt not more tunnel, but open space. Cool, slightly fresher air touched his face. They had reached a sump, a junction chamber. A faint, gray light filtered down from a rusted grate high above. And the sound was the low murmur of German voices, the clink of metal on metal, echoing down a vertical shaft. They were directly beneath the factory floor. One by one, they hauled themselves out of the pipe into the knee-deep, freezing water of the sump. They stood there, shivering, 20 blackened specters risen from the underworld, listening to the unsuspecting world of their enemy just above their heads. They had bypassed the forest, the minefields, the machine guns. They were inside the perfect defense. Volkov looked at his men, their eyes wide and gleaming white in the gloom. He saw no fear now, only a feral, predatory anticipation. They had become the ghosts. He gave a single, slow nod. The heart of the clockwork was now within reach, and they had come to stop it beating. The ascent from the sump was a vertical climb up a rusted iron ladder bolted to wet brick, each rung a potential betrayal of noise. They emerged not into a guarded hallway, but into the factory's underworld, a vast subterranean cellar of crumbling brick pillars and stagnant pools of water. The air was cold and carried the echoes of the factory above like distant thunder. It was the building's forgotten guts, and it was their highway. Volkov moved on instinct now, the map in his head replaced by a hunter's sense for the heart of the den. They passed through chambers filled with obsolete machinery, their shapes monstrous in the shadows. They flitted past a room where the Germans had set up a primitive latrine, the smell guiding them like a foul beacon. The evidence of the ghost's kingdom was everywhere. Neatly stacked empty ration tins, a repair bench for weapons with tools laid out in precise order, a bundle of wire coiled with mathematical perfection. They encountered their first sentry at the base of a stone staircase leading up. A young German soldier, leaning against the wall, humming a tuneless song to himself, his rifle slung. He was a boy, barely older than Klaus, lulled into a false sense of security by the impregnability of the forest above. Gromov's knife took him in the throat from behind, the sound a wet, brief sigh, lost in the ambient drip of water. They caught the body, laid it silently in the shadows. No alarm. The staircase led up to a heavy, iron-bound door. From beyond it, they could hear the clear, distinct sounds of the garrison, boots on concrete, the snap of a bolt being worked, a low command in German. This was the main factory floor. Volkov didn't hesitate. He nodded to the two largest men, who held a captured German Panzerfaust at the ready. It was a close-range, building-clearing weapon of horrific power. They braced. The rest of the squad pressed against the walls, fingers on triggers, hearts hammering against ribs. The whoosh-crump of the Panzerfaust was cataclysmic in the confined space. The door vanished in a storm of smoke, shredded wood, and molten metal. The concussion wave punched the air from Volkov's lungs. Before the dust settled, they were moving, pouring through the jagged hole into hell. The main factory hall was a scene from a frozen inferno. The explosion had turned the orderly depot into chaos. German soldiers, caught in various states of routine, cleaning a machine gun, sorting supplies, sleeping on cots, were reeling, blinded, deafened. The Soviet storm group did not give them time to recover. They fired in short, controlled bursts, cutting through the smoke. The sharp, staccato barks of their PPSH-41 submachine guns were answered by screams, by scattered return fire that cracked harmlessly into the ceiling. It was not a battle. It was a violent dissection. Gromov moved like a force of nature, his submachine gun a roaring scythe. Sasha, his face a mask of soot and rage, fought beside him, his movements sharp and efficient, the fear burned away in the furnace of action. They cleared corners, tossed grenades into side rooms, and advanced with a brutal, rehearsed rhythm. The Ghost's perfect machine was being dismantled from the inside, its components smashed by a hammer it never saw coming. Volkov's focus was a tunnel. He ignored the firefights, the dying gasps of the garrison. He pushed forward, through the hall, towards a second-tier office that overlooked the floor, a natural command post. A German corporal, blood streaming from his ears, lunged at him from behind a crate. Volkov sidestepped and clubbed the man down with the stock of his weapon, not breaking stride. He kicked open the office door. The room was an island of surreal, ordered calm. A map of the Seelow Heights was pinned to a drafting board, annotated with neat tactical symbols, defensive lines, unit markers, all obsolete. A small military-issue radio sat silent on the desk. A camp bed was made with parade ground tightness. And there, standing at the window with his back to the door, watching the carnage in his cathedral below, was Hauptmann Erich Schrader. The Ghost turned. He did not reach for the pistol on his desk. He simply stood, tall and straight in his faded but impeccably maintained uniform, the Iron Cross stark at his throat. His face was not that of a madman. It was gaunt, etched with exhaustion, but his eyes were clear, calm, and fathomlessly cold. They held the stillness of a deep, frozen lake. He looked at Volkov, at the smoke and blood staining his Soviet tunic, and showed no surprise. Only a weary, profound recognition. Below, the sounds of fighting were dying. Gromov's voice roared, echoing in the vast space. Clear. A single, final pistol shot rang out, then silence. The ghost's kingdom had fallen. Its last defenders were dead. The clockwork had been shattered by a sledgehammer from below. Yet, in this quiet office, the war continued. It had distilled into the space between two men. The Soviet captain, breathing heavily, weapon in hand, and the German Hauptmann, unarmed, standing amidst the ruins of his command. The screaming, the explosions, the chaos, it all faded into a distant murmur. Here now there was only this impossible, silent confrontation between the man who had come to end a war and the man for whom it could never end. The ghost finally moved. Not towards his weapon, but towards the map. His hand hovered over the line he had drawn, the line of the odor, the line he was ordered to hold. His finger tapped it once, a gesture of unshakable conviction. Then his icy eyes returned to Volkov. The message was in that look, in the set of his shoulders, in the very air of the room. You have taken my factory. You have killed my men, but you have not relieved me of my post. The true battle, Volkov realized with a sinking heart, was not over. It was just beginning. And its battlefield was no longer made of brick and forest, but of the unforgettable terrain of a single, unyielding mind. The silence in the office was a physical entity, thicker than the cordite smoke drifting through the shattered doorway. It was the silence of a world ending, observed by its last two inhabitants. Captain Volkov's submachine gun felt suddenly absurd in his hand, a crude tool for a task that had become profoundly abstract. Before him stood not a cowering fanatic, but the elegant, ruined architecture of a doomed principle. Hauptmann Schrader, the ghost, was the final functioning mechanism of a broken watch, still ticking in a vacuum. From the factory floor below came the sounds of Sergeant Gromov's grim triage, the clatter of collected weapons, the moans of the few surviving wounded Germans, the hard, curt commands of Soviet soldiers securing a victory that felt hollow. These sounds belonged to a different reality, one that stopped at the office threshold. Schrader moved. Slowly, deliberately, he walked to his desk. He did not look at his pistol. Instead, he opened a small, polished wooden case. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were his officer's insignia, a compass, and a folded, pristine German battle flag. He ignored these. He picked up a single sheet of paper, the last operational order for his regiment, dated April 15th, 1945. The paper was worn soft at the creases, its typed words underlined in faded ink. He held it for a moment, then placed it back with the reverence of a priest handling a sacrament. This was his authority, his universe. He then turned, and without a glance at Volkov, walked past him out of the office onto the metal gantry that overlooked the ravaged hall. Volkov followed, his weapon lowered but ready, an irrelevant formality. The scene below was a mural of defeat. Soviet soldiers moved among the German dead and wounded. The neat stacks of supplies were overturned and looted. The perfect order was now a museum of chaos. Schrader's men, the few still alive, were being gathered, their hands on their heads. They looked up and saw their commander on the walkway, not with hope, but with an exhausted, fatalistic resignation. Schrader observed it all. His gaze was not one of grief or anger, but of cold, clinical assessment. He was auditing the final balance sheet of his command. His jaw was tight, a single muscle twitching beneath the pale skin. This was the physical manifestation of the disaster his mind had refused to acknowledge for weeks. And still, he did not break. He assimilated it. He filed it under the heading of Last Stand. Then he looked at Volkov. His eyes were the color of a winter sky over the Baltic. They held no plea, no hatred, only a profound, unanswerable question. What now? Volkov understood the terrible logic. In Schroeder's world, a commanding officer did not surrender a position unless formally relieved by a superior or overwhelmed by a force he could not resist. The radio was silent. No superior would come, but Volkov and his men emerging from the earth like demons, they constituted that overwhelming force. The tactical condition for his cessation of duty had been met. Yet the protocol was incomplete. The ceremony of surrender was a part of the order he so desperately clung to. Volkov made a decision. He slung his submachine gun over his shoulder. He stood to his full height, the weariness in his bones momentarily burned away by the clarity of the moment. He was no longer just a Soviet officer. He was to become a function in the Ghost's dying ritual. He spoke in clear, formal German. His voice carried in the hushed space. Hauptmann Schroeder, the position is taken. Your command is relieved. You will order your remaining men to lay down their arms. For the first time, a flicker of something human passed behind Schroeder's eyes. Not relief. Recognition. Volkov had spoken the correct language. He had framed the end in the only terms the Ghost's mind could accept. Not a defeat by barbarians, but a military relief by a victorious opposing force following the unspoken rules of the profession. Schroeder turned to face his shattered domain. He drew a breath, and his voice, when it came, was not the shout of a broken man, but the clear, carrying parade ground command of a Prussian officer. It echoed off the soot-stained brick. Soldaten, die Stellung ist gefallen. Wir sind abgelassen Waffen niederlegen. Soldiers, the position has fallen. We are relieved. Lay down your arms. The words hung in the air. Below, the surviving Germans, 4 or 5 battered, bleeding men, slowly, one by one, placed their rifles and pistols on the concrete floor with a final hollow clatter. It was the sound of the war ending, for the second and final time, in this room. Schroeder watched them. His shoulders, which had held their ramrod stiffness for weeks, imperceptibly sagged. The mission, the endless looping command that had sustained him, was complete. He had been relieved. There was nothing left to hold. He turned back to Volkov. He gave a short, sharp, perfect nod, an acknowledgement between officers. Then his eyes looked past Volkov, through the broken glass of the office window, towards the east, towards the odor, towards the lines he had been ordered to hold. They were focused on a distance only he could see. His hand moved to the collar of his tunic, his fingers brushing the iron cross. He stood there, at attention, a statue of a vanished empire. Volkov took a step back. He did not give an order. He did not raise his weapon. He simply waited, a witness. The shot, when it came, was shockingly loud in the cavernous quiet. It did not come from Volkov. It did not come from Gromov below. Schroeder's own pistol was suddenly in his hand, a swift, fluid motion born of 1,000 drills. The barrel was placed under his chin. His eyes never left that distant horizon. His expression did not change. The sound was a single definitive period at the end of a long, run-on sentence of duty. His body crumpled, not with dramatic flourish, but with the simple, heavy finality of a falling tree. It landed on the metal gantry with a solid, unforgiving thud. Volkov did not move. He looked down at the body of the Ghost. The man who had haunted the heights, who had bled his battalion, who had turned a forest into a kingdom of the dead, was now just another corpse on a continent drowning in them. But this death was different. It was not a defeat. It was, in the ghost's own terrifying logic, the final, orderly act of command, the ultimate relief of duty. Gromov appeared at the top of the stairs, his face grim, taking in the scene. He looked from the body to Volkov. Volkov finally stirred. He walked to the edge of the gantry. Below, his men and the German prisoners stood frozen, looking up. "It's over," Volkov said, his voice flat, carrying through the factory. The words were not a celebration. They were a burial rite. He walked down the stairs, past his soldiers, out through the shattered main doors, into the gray morning light. The forest stood around the factory, silent, empty, just a forest again. The weight of the ghost's gaze was gone. The heights were just heights. He did not look back at the factory. He began the long walk back to camp, his men falling in silently behind him. There were no cheers, no songs, only the sound of their boots on the broken earth, a slow, solemn drumbeat for a war that had, at last, truly ended. Captain Andrei Volkov had won his battle, and in the hollow victory, he felt not triumph, but the immense, silent weight of the peace he had purchased at such a terrible, understanding cost.